This video was brought to you by Squarespace.
Too bright.
Nintendo has a lot of strengths, but I would say a particular strength is their consistency.
Ever since they entered the video game business, they've consistently strove for innovation. More so than any other company, they have delighted their customers with surprising new ideas, year after year. They've always wanted to charm us, to give us a taste of that Nintendo magic that is entirely unique to them. And of course, there are some occasional exceptions, especially when it comes to artistic direction, but for the most part, they consistently deliver quality products. When you look at that Nintendo label, you have a very good idea of what you're getting. They've spent decades carefully building up a particular reputation.
But there are, of course, areas where they're a little less consistent, and one such area is their re-releases. Be they remakes, remasters, something between those two things, or simple enhanced ports, the differences between titles can sometimes be staggering.
Even just recently, we've gotten some prime examples of how much Nintendo re-releases can vary. Super Mario RPG, a complete ground-up remake of the SNES original with added features. Then Paper Mario, the Thousand-Year Door, all assets completely redone. Everything is slick and shiny. It looks like a modern game. And they made all sorts of tweaks and redesigned much of the UI. And then there's Luigi's Mansion 2 HD. It's Luigi's Mansion 2, but in HD. Character models and probably other assets have been updated a bit, but it barely looks half as good as Luigi's Mansion 3 and features essentially no other changes. And now we've got another similar example coming in Donkey Kong Country Returns HD. It certainly looks better than the Wii and 3DS versions, but not by much. And again, no extra features or content or anything, which makes a little more sense. I get it, the 3DS version already had extra stuff. But it's still weird to hold this and Luigi's Mansion 2 HD up to Thousand Year Door and Mario RPG. You're holding both and you're looking at the two and you're just like, there's something's not right here. And like, what Nintendo chooses to re-release is weird enough. When we've still got all these other games we would love to see remastered or remade or even just ported to Switch, what made them choose another version of DKC Returns? Sometimes it's a little baffling, but mostly this is an issue of the effort put into each title and how they're priced. It's just strange that a complete remake that looks like a brand new game and even adds to and improves the experience can land so close to a very basic HD touch-up that is otherwise identical to the original. Weirdest of all though, both are the same price. And don't get me wrong, I know all game development is complicated and takes a lot of effort. Even the simplest of remasters can't possibly be as simple as they might seem. But I just can't imagine that these titles had anything close to the same budget or development timeline.
I also must clarify at this stage that the point of this video is not to complain or to suggest that there's some huge problem with Nintendo's re-releases. I just think it's interesting to explore this phenomenon. It's something that we've all observed, especially in recent times. Stop the video while I remind you that it was brought to you by Squarespace.
Squarespace makes building a website so simple anyone can do it. Start from scratch or work with a template, and using the intuitive builder, you can embed pictures and videos and format everything however you want without writing a single line of code. My site, Arlo Recommends, is a blog, so it's super easy to write up my posts, throw in some nice pictures, whatever I want, schedule them all to publish, and even push to social media automatically. Everything is easy. Everything looks great. I can use the built-in analytics tool to see how my posts are performing, and if I ever need more, I know that Squarespace offers lots of powerful extensions. To try out Squarespace for yourself, head to squarespace.com for a free trial. Then when you're ready to launch, head to squarespace.com/Arlo to save 10% off your first website or domain.
And now for today's recommendation, Dojo Rich.
This guy makes what is essentially acoustic techno using didgeridoos, and it's incredible! He's got loads of songs and performances and collaborative pieces on his channel. It's just always so fun to find someone making truly unique music.
Thanks again to Squarespace. Resume the video.
There really ain't too much to complain about. For the most part, Nintendo has been spoiling us this generation. I mean, come on. Pikmin 3 Deluxe gave us countless tweaks, difficulty options, the return of the Piclopedia, and a whole new mini-campaign. Super Mario 3D World plus Bowser's Fury gave us substantial tweaks that dramatically improved the gameplay, along with a self-contained, open-world, highly experimental adventure. Kirby's Return to Dreamland also included a new campaign with hugely different gameplay, starring the game's villain. Oh, then you've got Metroid Prime Remastered. Okay, no new content or anything, fine. But every single asset was completely redone and the game looks impossibly good. Plus, it shadow dropped during a direct and it's only $40. Nintendo has been delivering some incredible re-releases. But if anything, I think that's just been making the lower effort ones a little bit more noticeable, a little bit harder to take. Like, look at all these games, and then look at Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. I still can't believe this game exists. From time to time, I'll be randomly reminded of it, and I just get mad. They are unacceptably ugly, faithful to the DS versions in only the worst ways, and they don't even include any of the improvements or extra features or content from Pokemon Diamond for a reason that to this day, no one has been able to explain. Those games represent the barest of bare minimum effort, the most cynical products ever published by Nintendo in my eyes. But I suppose I get it. Pokemon is somewhat separate from Nintendo's other first-party IPs, so it is legally exempt from the need to adhere to the Nintendo seal of quality. Man, and if you do want to talk about Pokemon, there's a whole history of inconsistent re-releases right there. Some titles are amazing, definitive remakes, and others inexplicably leave out loads of content. And it's funny because you'd think that the amount of effort that goes into a re-release would depend at least somewhat on the popularity of its respective series. But Pokemon alone proves that that ain't necessarily how it works, at least not always. Zelda does indeed seem to get preferential treatment when it comes to re-releases. Zelda remasters and ports have a long and storied history, with Nintendo refreshing every single pre-Breath of the Wild 3D Zelda. The 2D titles still need more love, but I'm hopeful it'll start to happen someday. And I think this must have something to do with how important and beloved Zelda is, but not necessarily as much to do with sales. Because if you look at things purely from the standpoint of, a game that sells well will be the best fit for a substantial re-release, Nintendo once more defies expectations. Let's look at Luigi's Mansion 2 HD again and hold it up to another Switch remaster, Skyward Sword HD. They both sport the same HD moniker, yet differences abound. The latter received a massive overhaul of its entire control system, as well as countless little tweaks to the whole experience based on player feedback over the years. The former got the graphical polish, and that's it. But this is a big 3D Zelda versus a handheld Luigi's Mansion game. Zelda is surely a lot more popular, right? Well, the original Skyward Sword barely sold 3.5 million units, whereas Luigi's Mansion 2 sold 6.5. Yet Zelda was the game that got all this special treatment. And even since Nintendo drastically improved Skyward Sword and put it on the incredibly healthy Switch, it still hasn't even come close to selling as much as Luigi's Mansion 2 originally did. Man, poor Skyward Sword. It couldn't even beat Link's Awakening. And that is surprising. You could argue that Skyward Sword had more problems than Luigi's Mansion and therefore simply needed more work to re-release. But even though Dark Moon had fewer flaws overall, it still had one very major flaw in its mission system, which was bad enough to completely ruin the game for a pretty dramatic percentage of the audience, and yet Nintendo made no effort to fix it. Despite it being a much more successful game, it just didn't get the same treatment. Nintendo just didn't feel like it. I do think we're onto something here though. Even if there are still strange discrepancies, the amount of effort Nintendo puts into a re-release probably has more to do with the needs of the individual game than anything. Some games simply have more to improve, especially when you consider graphics. Some games need a full remake to be brought up to modern standards, and others really just need a touch-up. Some games require a lot of little fixes, and others are probably fine to just release as is with minimal changes beyond necessary ones to controls and the like. It does make sense, but customers are always looking for value, and we can't help but notice these drastic differences in effort put forth by Nintendo. We can't help but point out the inconsistencies. But let's explore another category of re-release beyond remasters: smaller, simpler, upscaled ports. Really, I would say that the weirdest thing here is how few of these there actually are. Pikmin 1+2 and Super Mario 3D All-Stars are really the main ones. Nintendo could get away with doing so many more of these. And yeah, it's nice when instead of a simple upscaled port, we get like a full remake or something. But if Nintendo's not into putting in the effort, more of these would at least be better than nothing, am I right? Can we at least get a basic port of F-Zero GX while we wait for you to eventually decide to remake it 20 years from now? But for some reason, Nintendo just ain't into doing that. Giving us Pikmin 1 and 2 to go along with 3 Deluxe so we had access to the whole series before the release of 4, that was genius. That was the perfect move. But then 3D All-Stars was this weird in-between where it was simultaneously a disappointing collection considering the improvements made to the games by fans over the years, and actually a pretty great deal when you consider how stingy Nintendo is and how long it took them to give us modern versions of these games at all. But even there's a weird inconsistency. 1, Nintendo gave us Galaxy 1, but not 2, so that's frustrating. Even more though, Nintendo thought 3D All-Stars was such a good deal that they only wanted to sell it for a limited time. And no, I don't buy the idea that they made it limited because it was a celebration, and that celebration could only last during that one anniversary. I completely believe that they just didn't like the idea of selling 3 Mario games for that one price forever. Even when it comes to simple upscaled ports, their methods are all over the place. Then consider that Pikmin 1+2 also falls into another unique category of Nintendo re-release. Pairs of old games that individually aren't worth full price, but are sold as a 2-pack for $60, which still seems like a little much. As much as I love Pikmin, anyone who's not a Pikmin freak might not want to pay $30 each for these old games with very little in the way of graphical improvements, especially considering how short the first game is compared to the second. 2 literally has 4 or 5 times the content, and both are the same price. Then there's Another Code Recollection, Famicom Detective Club, and Advance Wars Reboot Camp. All 3 are pairs of complete remakes of old, long-neglected games, and all are very high-quality products. But at full price, they're a hard sell for anyone not already invested in these series. Nintendo probably sees them as a great value since you're getting 2 games in 1. But even just compared to similar indie games in these same genres and the amount of content you get, these are extremely pricey. So this is an unfortunate case where Nintendo is remaking these beloved old games and doing it really, really well, but the price alone is throwing off the whole thing. And once more, I can't help but hold these up to other titles like Metroid Prime Remastered, an epic 3D adventure with cutting-edge graphics, or Super Mario 3D World plus Bowser's Fury with its wealth of content. The Famicom Detective Club games are like 6 hours long your first time through, and only a couple hours if you know what you're doing, and they're visual novels with very little in terms of gameplay or even animations. That doesn't mean they're bad games. They're probably still great experiences, but look at how much money Nintendo is asking for these products. I get that a game's budget isn't the only factor that plays into its price. I know things are more complicated than that, but sometimes Nintendo makes it genuinely difficult to ignore these discrepancies. How can this be the same price as this? Yet another category of re-release that highlights Nintendo's weird inconsistency is high-effort re-releases that have been inexplicably stranded on old systems. I think Wind Waker and Twilight Princess HD probably just popped up in the minds of every single person watching this video. Nintendo did a bunch of work remastering these 2 games. They touched up the graphics, they made loads of tweaks to the gameplay and even quests, and they added a bunch of new features. Twilight Princess even got a new little dungeon edition, which was locked behind an amiibo, but still. They didn't even charge full price for these games, though they kinda did by bundling with the amiibo, and if they released these today, they would 100% charge full price. It goes without saying they were in a very different financial position back then. Point is though, they released those games on the Wii U, which promptly dropped dead, and we haven't heard a thing about them since. Every single year, we have waited for these excellent remasters to make the jump to Switch. All this time, the Switch just continued to sell more and more units. It exceeded the Wii U's sales to such a staggering degree that we were all sure Nintendo would port the games over. They put in so much work and got so little in return because of the Wii U's tiny install base. Sure, they'd have to unincorporate the whole second screen dynamic, which would be a pain, but surely it would be worth it considering all the other work that would carry over flawlessly, right? Put these games on Switch and suddenly you're selling them to literally 10 times the people. The Switch's install base is basically 10 times bigger. So, where are the games? We're looking around, where's the games at? The Switch is fast approaching the end of its life, and those two games are still nowhere to be seen. Then the 3DS is a re-release graveyard. Near the end of its life, Nintendo did a bunch of re-releases because these are naturally easier and cheaper to develop than new games, which makes sense when a system is winding down. It's what we're seeing with the Switch now. But the problem is that now we've got all these great games completely stranded on 3DS. Now, only a few years later, it is impossible to purchase these games officially. And even if you feel like shelling out for an expensive physical copy, you might not want to play them on that tiny little low-res 3DS screen. Even when the Switch was proving that handheld gaming could be just as good as home console gaming, Nintendo was putting all of this effort into new versions of old games, which essentially looked worse than the originals simply by nature of being on the 3DS. And then they just left them there to rot. Two beloved Mario and Luigi games were completely remade for 3DS. Vanillification of some baddies and other visual elements aside, these were great remakes. And each even included a brand new campaign, which is obviously the gold standard for re-releases. It's the best you can ever expect to get. And these remakes were stuck on a dying system, the poor sales tanked their developer, and now none of us can buy them. Even with a brand new Mario and Luigi game on the horizon, the great remake of the first game, published only 7 years ago, is completely inaccessible to new players. Then there's Kirby's Epic Yarn. Switch has got loads of Kirby games, but not that one. Yoshi's Woolly World, the game that everyone loved way more than they ended up loving Crafted World a few years later. What's that? It's stranded on Wii U? Haha, well, we'll take care of that. Now it's also stranded on 3DS. Then the biggest one for me personally, Luigi's Mansion got a pseudo remake on 3DS, which made a little sense since the original game was planned to use some sort of 3D effect. So it was like, oh, now it's in 3D after all these years. They got to realize that idea. That's kind of cool. But at the same time, we'd been begging for a nice HD remaster for years, and this game featured a bunch of remade assets like a true remaster. But again, this was the 3DS. I love the 3DS, I love its games, and it served its purpose at the time, but through a modern lens, that low resolution is just abysmal. In my opinion, this remake of Luigi's Mansion looked worse than the original. They remade the game, and it looked even worse. And they put in all this effort. They even stuck Gooigi in the game so you could play co-op. That is a huge change. But they did all that just to leave the poor thing on the 3DS and immediately forget it, leave it behind them forever. And the extra effort they put into that game just makes the bare bones Luigi's Mansion 2 HD even weirder. Let's put a ton of effort into a new version of Luigi's Mansion 1 and strand it on the 3DS, which is on its last legs. Then let's put as little effort as possible into a new version of Luigi's Mansion 2 and put it on the Switch, which is the healthiest console we've ever had. It's like spending all day preparing a gourmet feast and giving it to a 5-year-old who only eats the cheese out of the salad and throws the rest away. Then making chicken nuggets in the oven for the adult who's looking for a fancy meal. Now, of course, we don't know what the future will bring. I once lamented the lack of Pikmin representation on Switch, and then I blinked, and suddenly the entire series was there. Maybe all these re-releases, along with those darn Zelda remasters, will show up on a modern platform one of these days. Maybe. I will say that at least as far as 3DS games go, DKC Returns has given me renewed hope. For a while, I was worried that if Nintendo put effort into re-releasing a game on a previous system, they weren't gonna want to re-release it again anytime soon. But Returns got an upgraded version on 3DS, and now it's getting a remaster on Switch. Sure, it took like a decade or something, but it's happening. And that means that technically any of those other games could also make the jump. But if you want to flip it around again, if anything, DKC Returns being the first of these games to be re-released just further highlights how inconsistent and unpredictable Nintendo is in this department. Why that game? Why was that the best candidate? I have no idea. When it comes to what games Nintendo chooses to re-release, we must simply chalk things up to the Big N working in mysterious ways. But as for the inconsistency between releases, both in terms of effort put in and pricing, ultimately, I think it probably does just come down to this. Nintendo puts more effort into some and less effort into others and sells them all for more or less the same price because they can. Because they can. Sometimes it makes sense to put in a lot of work, and other times they see an opportunity to do a relatively small amount of work because they know that their return on investment will be much greater. And hey, I get it. That's just working strategically. Nintendo can do a lot with their re-releases, but they also want the option to just kinda not sometimes. They used to really rely on their handheld division to bolster the rest of their company because they could create handheld games at a fraction of the cost and still see wild success in terms of sales. For a long time, Nintendo balanced delivering big AAA experiences and smaller scale titles. Some projects with very big budgets don't end up selling as well as they wanted, and some projects with relatively tiny budgets end up offering a dramatic return on investment. This variety is good, and as a YouTuber, I certainly get it. I understand the frustration of putting a ton of work and money into a long, tightly scripted and edited video on a topic I really care about, and seeing that it didn't perform half as well as this other video on some topical news of the day junk I threw together in an hour. The difference in effort is staggering, but if anything, it's those cheesy, easy successes that allow me to put out the higher quality stuff. If you're creating something and selling it or otherwise getting money from it, your return on investment will vary. So from that perspective, it makes sense. It's nice to have an easy win. It's nice to be able to put in less effort and still see a lot of success sometimes. Maybe it's this imbalance that enables Nintendo to sometimes go above and beyond. Like they know that sometimes it's worth putting in more work than they need to because some other easier release will make up for it. Maybe Luigi's Mansion 2 HD walked so Thousand Year Door could run. Ultimately, I just think it wouldn't be as much of an issue if they were a little more flexible with their pricing. If the prices of these re-releases made a little more sense and lined up with the effort put in just a little more. Or if they just put their darn games on sale more often. It is incredible how much none of this would matter if Nintendo just gave us better discounts. It is amazing how much of a non-issue this would all be if they were willing to budge a bit more on their prices, at least down the line. Release the games at full price. Sure, make that extra money from people so excited they want to buy day one. Just like, how about some better discounts later? Like eventually. Not so soon that it affects day one sales. Even if we had to wait a few years to buy Famicom Detective Club or Mario vs. DK or whatever at half price or less, that wouldn't be so bad. Just work with us here. Premium pricing for every single product, plus extremely stingy discounts. That's a painful combination. Give us something. But anyway, back to basic pricing. I know it's a big and ongoing discussion, but Nintendo believes fewer sales at a higher price is somehow better than more sales at a lower price, and especially in the case of smaller series that need to reach more people and make more fans, this is backwards in my eyes. Budge just a little, and you'll still make lots of money, maybe even just as much money, maybe even more money, and you will also aid in the long-term growth of these series. And in any case, it would just be nice to not have to pay so darn much for a re-release with a lot less going for it. But again, I suppose I can see it from Nintendo's perspective. If Thousand Year Door is $60 and Luigi's Mansion 2 HD is $40, well then that's basically just Nintendo tattling on themselves, isn't it? That's them admitting that there is a huge value discrepancy between the two titles. They want all their games to look like high-quality, high-value products. They don't want to conveniently categorize their games in this way. If Nintendo made it and put it together in one package and you can go to the store and buy it, it is almost always going to be $60. They want to appear confident that all their products are worth paying a premium for, so that no one is stopping short and second-guessing based on prices. I don't think I necessarily agree with this mode of thinking, especially in this age of easy digital distribution and a tremendous amount of competition from a very large industry. A game needs to be seen as a value when you consider the price. And if a series already has relatively niche appeal and thus a small fan base, you've got to be proactive in getting that series in front of new people. It's a whole thing. I know I'm always going on and on about it, but I think I at least see where they're coming from, if this is indeed their thinking. We make the games, and if you want to play them, you pay a premium. Simple as that. See, but then why is Metroid Prime Remastered $40? It doesn't make sense. I swear, that one game introduces so much weirdness into this whole conversation. It defies all logic, debunks all theories. So much effort, but for so little money. Famicom Detective Club is $60 and this is $40? Mario vs. Donkey Kong is $50. Oh, thanks for the budget price, Nintendo. What a steal. And this is $40? Is it because they know Metroid needs the boost? Because Metroid Prime 4 is coming out and clearly has a very high budget, so they need to make sure as many people play it as possible? But then why are the Pikmin remasters so expensive? That series was in the same boat. I don't get it. Sometimes it feels like this amount of baffling inconsistency is just to mess with us. Closing thoughts. It's funny because it's easy to look at 3DS and Switch and imagine that this inconsistency is maybe a relatively new thing. The merging of Nintendo's handheld and home console divisions solved a lot of problems, but it kind of created a new problem because now it's a little harder for Nintendo to develop titles with these wildly differing budgets and price them easily. Gone are the days of pumping out simple little GBA games and charging whatever for them. Now, if a super low budget game is on Switch, it's got to be of at least a certain level of quality to justify the hefty price tag, or they've got to just sell it at full price or close to full price and accept the lower sales. Personally, I feel like the eShop is really the answer to this whole problem. It gives Nintendo a platform to release smaller games for lower prices without having to support a whole handheld ecosystem. Kind of a have your cake and eat it too situation, you know? It's hard for me to believe that Mario vs. DK made more money as a $50 physical retail title than it would have as a $25 eShop title, but whatever. Point is though, this inconsistency actually stretches back a lot further than the 3DS. It's definitely more pronounced now, but there have been a good few weirdly low-effort re-releases in the past. For a counterexample, Zelda's always had a good track record, as we talked about, with re-releases spread out over loads of systems, all the way back to the Game Boy. But then the GBA had a whole bunch of extremely cheap ports. The Super Mario Advance series did add some cool stuff, and maybe I'm in the minority here. I know everybody really loves those games, but man, at those prices, they were a tough sell for me. Even more egregious though, Nintendo also put out a bunch of NES ports for $20 each, even when you could get copies for your e-reader for $5 or just play in Animal Crossing for free. Because back then, those games weren't nearly as valuable as they are now. These ports were wildly overpriced, sure, but whoever did buy them sent a lot of money Nintendo's way. Ah, but that was probably because the GBA was a good success. To swing back to the Wii U, that system struggled, and that was also when Nintendo gave us a bunch of inexplicably high-value re-releases. They sold a bunch of amazing Super NES games for 30 cents each during an anniversary promotion, and for another baffling Metroid-related value, they gave us a digital port of Metroid Prime Trilogy, a game that was super rare and valuable and offered a ridiculous value even when it launched at $50, and they sold it for $20. What's a better deal? All 3 AAA Metroid Prime games with updated controls and tons of bonus content, or Ice Climbers? You decide. Does all this really just come down to how well Nintendo is doing? How desperate they are to get people to buy a system? I mean, maybe, probably. That would explain why, with the wild success of the Switch, we are in a new era of paying out the nose for anything and everything Nintendo related. Except Metroid Prime Remastered. Whatever the case, I guess there's always been a precedent for selling games with wildly differing value propositions. Even beyond re-releases, Nintendo will sell you an epic 3D adventure directed by their highest paid senior staff, developed over the course of half a decade, costing who even knows how many millions of dollars. Then they'll turn around and sell you a minigame collection for only $10 less. That's just Nintendo, I guess. They're a funny bunch, but we love them. They're weird and baffling and a little bit greedy, but we love them. Well, thanks for watching. Now, if you'll excuse me, I gotta go pre-order DKC Returns HD. For work. I'm only buying it because of work.